about about moral self-ignorance, I think. So, Eric, please, can you share your slides? Yeah, perfect.
Are you seeing the slides?
Yes.
All right, great. Yes, moral self-ignorance. So I've been thinking about this for several years and wanting to write the paper on this, but I haven't yet written that paper. And I'd been hoping that I'd have it a little more organized before today. So this is definitely work in progress, where I'm still kind of doing the background reading I need to do and organizing my thoughts. So I definitely welcome, thoughts and structuring ideas and criticisms. All right, so let's think about the general idea of a moralometer to start, right? So think about something like a thermometer. If you want to do a science of body temperature, it would be good if you had some measuring instrument that was reliable to measure someone's body temperature, right? You could just go on people's feelings of being hot or feelings of being cold, or various kinds of things that are associated with body temperature. But ideally, you'd want some good measure of body temperature, right? And then you could correlate body temperature with other things, use it as a diagnostic tool. Similarly, if we want to do a science of morality, which I think philosophers and psychologists are increasingly interested in, it would be useful if we could have a moralometer, some way of measuring people's morality, right? So if we had a good moralometer, then we could do things like interventions, right? Measure someone's morality before they, say, engage in a practice, a study of Buddhist meditation, or before they take a business ethics class, or whatever you think might be a good moral intervention, right? And then take their moral temperature, so to speak, after the intervention and see whether the intervention had any effect. You had a good moralometer. You could also look at correlations between your someone's moral traits and other facts about them. For example, some philosophers think that morality and hedonic well-being are correlated, right? Moral people are happier, right? Is that true? It seems like this is a hard question to answer if we don't have a way of accurately measuring people's morality. I think there are basically 4 approaches to building a moralometer. I'm going to talk about one of them today, the self-report approach. Right? You could say, okay, well, the way to measure morality is to ask people how moral they are. A few other approaches would be informant ratings, right? That would be asking the friends or acquaintances or family or coworkers of somebody how moral they are. Or you could do behavioral observation, right? You could basically bring them into the lab and see how they act, or you could observe them in their daily activities and try to use that as a measure of people's morality. Or the final approach, you could do some kind of physiological measurement, right? You could show them pictures of people being murdered and see what reaction they have physiologically to that, say in their brain or in their skin conductance. Or maybe you could look at their genome. Maybe certain people with certain genomes are more likely to be moral than people with other genomes. I'm inclined to think that all 4 of these ways of trying to measure morality are approximately hopeless. So I've been talking about that for a couple of years, right? I've got this paper going called The Non-Existence of Moralometers. I'm working on this collaboratively with psychologist Jesse Sun. When I first started presenting the ideas, my teenage daughter refuted me thusly. This was my birthday gift a couple of years ago. She designed a moralometer. There it is. As you can see from her moralometer, it's got this blue pointer in the middle that says, how moral are you? And on the good side, tells the truth, does not cheat, keeps promises. then you're okay. In the middle is bad, lying, bullying, being unjust. And then on the far right side, we see evil, murder, thief, and breaking promises. All right, so you know that we haven't yet tested the validity of that moralometer, but let's talk about self-report moralometers. All right, so here's an example of a self-report moralometer. Overall, I would describe myself as, on a scale from 1 to 7, extremely immoral to extremely moral. So one question to think is, would asking someone a question like that be a good diagnosis, a good approach to figuring out whether that person is actually moral, right? Are moral people more likely to tick high numbers, 6 or 7 on the scale, and immoral people likely to tick low numbers, 1 or 2? Or is it going to be a weak correlation or a 0 correlation or even maybe a negative correlation? And what I'm going to suggest is that we should probably expect about a 0 correlation between how people will respond to questions like this and their actual overall moral character. And I should point out that there are some psychologists who are doing pretty much exactly this. Mike Furr and colleagues have recently published what they call the Moral Character Questionnaire. It has questions about general morality. For example, and these are all on a 1 to 5 Likert scale from agree to disagree. I think now I've forgotten whether it's either strongly agree to strongly disagree or just agree to disagree. I'm not, but it's an agree disagree scale, 5 points. And it's got questions like, I would say that I'm a good person. I'm not a particularly virtuous person, reverse scored, of course. I'm a person of strong moral character. I consistently want to do the moral thing. I tend to act morally. I believe that being moral is important. All right, so these are 6 general moral questions, and how people respond to those questions, Furr and colleagues interpret as a self-report of one's overall general morality. They also have sub-questions on honesty, compassion, fairness, loyalty, respect, and purity. Questions like, I am a loyal person, or I would say that I'm a wholesome person, relatively pure. All right, and sorry, I do have a note here that says it goes from strongly disagree to strongly agree. All right, so I just want you to pause for a minute to think about your intuitions about how valid a measure like this might be. Let me mention one possible source of problems here, which would be honesty and socially desirable responding. All right, so socially desirable responding is a tendency in psychology that's pretty frequently noticed for people not to want to portray themselves negatively to experimenters. People want to come across to experimenters as basically being good, smart, honest, nice, having all of those characteristics. People tend not to kind of honestly reveal the negative sides of themselves to experimenters. So if we think socially desirable responding would be going on, that would be a reason to predict that people would tend to avoid the bottom of the scale here, right? It would just be a straightforward prediction of the tendency towards socially desirable responding that few people would say, oh yeah, I'm a morally bad person. However, I think it's possibly even more complicated than that, because just ticking strongly agree with every possible question, yes, I'm extremely moral, right, might seem immodest, right? So there might be actually some social desirability pressure to avoid consistently ticking the top of the scale and saying, yeah, I'm the greatest guy ever. So what exactly the result of socially desirable responding might be that you would tend to describe yourself as above average, maybe substantially above average, but you won't say, yes, I'm the greatest saint who's ever walked the earth. So I think we might expect those two kinds of social desirability pressures to have some kind of effect on people's self-reports of their own morality. You might see this especially with something like humility, right? So another kind of measure of morality, much more a self-report measure of morality that's much more used than Fur et al., which is only proposed last year, is the honesty humility factor in the Hexaco personality test. So I don't know if you got how much personality psychology you know, but kind of the most widely used personality self-report test is called the Big Five test. It's got 5 facets of personality, but one competitor to it that's also been widely used is the Hexaco. And the Hexaco has a factor, the H factor, for honesty, humility, and it's got questions on it like, I'm an ordinary person who is no better than others. There's also Jen Wright and others have recently developed a humility scale, which they call the dual dimension humility scale. And it's got questions like, I often place the interests of others over my own interests. So one question that developers of these scales, like Lee and Ashton for the Hexaco and Jennifer Wright for the DDHS, you develop a scale like this and you want to see, part of the validation of personality scales usually is trying to see whether the performance on these tests correlates with the kinds of things that you would expect it to correlate with. So there have been a few attempts to try to correlate performance on these scales with behavioral measures that you might expect that say people who are honest or humble would tend to engage in. So, for example, in presenting the DDHS, Jen Wright and colleagues present one behavioral measure, which they suggests that this is a valid measure of humility. What they did was they had people take a chair and place it next to someone that they're having a conversation with. And they found that people who scored higher on the dual dimension humility scale would place the chair. Oh my gosh, now I'm forgetting which the effect is, but which direction it is, right? But if it's the person that they're having that they expect to disagree with, maybe they place the chair further, and if it's a person they expect to agree with, maybe they place it closer. Now I'm actually forgetting the direction of the effect. I should have noted that down in the slides here, but anyway, they find the small but not super consistent and not really a priori super compelling behavioral effect that goes along with people's responses on the dual dimension humility scale. And I guess kind of what I want to suggest is that by itself is not super convincing. What you tend to find, well, when personality psychologists are trying to validate scales like this, they tend not to very often look for correlations with real world behavior. And when they do, the correlations are not super strong and compelling. And this seems to me to fall into that general pattern. And since I tend to be on the skeptical side, one of the things that I'm inclined to think is researchers who are presenting scales like this, they want their scales to seem valid and to correlate with things in the world. And so There is a publication bias in favor of presenting positive results. There's a tendency to apply statistics in a way that will maximize the appearance of favorable results. There might also be tendencies when you're doing laboratory studies, especially for participants to anticipate the hypothesis under test and thus behave in ways that confirm results, right? So a participant who just said, oh, I'm very humble, right, reports that to the experimenter. Maybe now they're motivated in a follow-up laboratory behavior to act humble because they just presented themselves that way, right? Seems like the experimenter now kind of is demanding in a certain sense that they behave according to their self-report. So I think there are lots of reasons, and we find this generally in psychology, and I think this is part of the root of the replication crisis, right? There are lots of reasons to think that there would be spurious positive correlations in social psychology that are where you find a lot of weak and inconsistent but positive relationships. So I feel like the evidence on self-report of moral traits like this arguably fits with that pattern. It's still relatively early days in measuring and self-report of moral character, so that's definitely not, I think, an established conclusion, but I just want to put that out there as a possible reading of the evidence as it currently stands. Now, if we go back to the FIR questionnaire, right, the moral characteristics questionnaire, basically people self-rating how morally good they are overall. If you look at the mean scores on this questionnaire, it's a 5-point from strongly agree, strongly disagree to strongly agree, right? The mean scores on most of these general moral questions are going to be over 4. They're going to be like 4.3-ish, I think, for most of them, 4.2 on this 5-point scale, which means that the majority of people are marking themselves at the top. There are not many people who answer 1, who say, oh, yes, I strongly disagree that I am overall a morally good person. So majority of people are rating themselves 5. Almost everybody is rating themselves either 5 or 4. And you might think, well, look, comparing the 5s and the 4s, could those who are rating themselves as 4 instead of 5 actually be more virtuous because they're kind of modest? They're recognizing the ways in which they're failing to meet the highest standards of morality, right? So you might imagine, say, a dedicated Christian who's like, yeah, I'm very acutely aware of how my life is not following the model of Jesus, so I better not click 5. But actually, that person might be much more moral than someone who just kind of casually says, oh, yeah, I'm a great guy. So I think there's at least some possibility here that there would be an inverse relationship between people's actual moral character and how they rate themselves on this scale. Right? The most morally admirable people might tend to hold themselves to high standards, right, and be acutely aware of how they fall short. Another way of thinking about this is using Samin Vazir's SOCA model of character traits. So this is short for self-other knowledge asymmetry, SOKA. Vazir argues that self-knowledge tends to be weak when traits are highly evaluative and not directly observable. And self-knowledge tends to be good of your personality traits when they're not highly evaluative and they are directly observable. So think about something like talkativeness. Right? Talkativeness is pretty observable, right? You can kind of tell whether you're someone who's chattering a lot or someone who's pretty quiet. And it's okay to be talkative and it's okay to be quiet, right? So it's not highly evaluative. So when you look at a trait like talkativeness, people's self-ratings of talkativeness tend to correlate with peers' ratings of those people's talkativeness, which then tend to correlate with experimental direct measures of how talkative someone is. So if you bring them into a laboratory conversation and see how much they chat. Right, so self-knowledge attentiveness is probably pretty good. But you take something like being unfair, that's highly evaluative. So people are going to be motivated to see themselves in one way. People want to see themselves as fair rather than unfair. And it's not really directly observable. It's very hard to observe whether someone is a fair person or not. And if you're not behaving fairly, then you could engage in self-deception or rationalization or repression, as Beata was just talking about, of the fact of your unfairness. So you'll find that for some traits in several recent studies, like John and Robbins, 1993, Sun and Goodwin, 2020, you'll see near zero correlations, sometimes, not always, but often, between self and informant ratings for traits like being unfair. Right, so where these informants, depending on the study, they might be peers, like if you're using university students, who would be people who live in the same dormitory, could be family, could be teachers. Sun and Goodwin use nominees, where participants will be asked to nominate somebody who knows them well, who then fills out a personality test on the person's behalf. And there you see sometimes, as I'm saying, near zero correlations between self-ratings and informant ratings about traits like unfair. In some cases, you'll find correlations between moral traits like being kind or being unfair with self-ratings. There are a couple reasons that you could find spurious positive correlations between informant ratings and self-ratings. One is that informants might be making the same moral mistakes as the targets, right? So if you don't think it's unfair that, just to take a silly example, that you stole a certain amount of money from a friend, then you might nominate an informant who has the same moral opinion about your having stolen the money. Right? People will tend to nominate as informants people that will confirm their self-opinion. Yeah, that's the second bullet point, sorry. And the first bullet point is people might make the same moral mistakes as the targets, right? So I better make, I guess that's the example I gave kind of serves both those purposes, right? But just to give you another example, right? Maybe you think that it's a high expression of purity that you go and protest at an abortion clinic, right? So you might nominate informants that also have that opinion about what purity amounts to. Now, it might not be the case that protesting at an abortion clinic is in fact a morally pure thing to do, right? But you would still end up with a correlation between your self-rating of purity and the informant's rating of purity, because the informant and the self have the same opinion about this issue. All right, so further problems, right? So a self-rater of morality might be wrong about their morality for various reasons, right? So, for example, someone who is sexist might not see anything wrong with their sexist behavior, right? So imagine someone who's a pretty bad implicit sexist. They might not notice their implicit sexism. They turn their attention away from it, or they might see an act. They might engage in some minor sexual harassment and say, oh, just playing around. They don't see anything wrong with it, right? So self-rater could be mistaken about their own morality, right? Or to take the abortion clinic case, right? Shouting someone down at a Planned Parenthood clinic, they might think that is, a very morally good thing to do. It might not, in fact, be a very morally good thing to do. Right, so if self-ratings about morality are based on mistakes about morality, then we'd expect self-raters to be wrong. Self-raters might incorrectly weigh different aspects of morality. So, for example, think about consequentialism and charitable giving or vegetarianism. right? On some views, some ethical views, some consequentialist views in ethics, one of the most morally good thing you could do would be to donate substantial amounts of money to effective charities. Other people might think, well, yeah, that's good, but it's not that good. It's better to be a nice person to the people around you, right? So consequentialists and others might disagree on those kinds of things, right? And without taking a stand on that issue, if the consequentialists are right, then the person who's not a consequentialist might be substantially misweighing the, whether being nice to the people around you, they might think that's more important in their overall moral character than giving a lot of money. They're substantially misweighing the relative values of those things. Or if the consequentialist is wrong, then the consequentialist is substantially misweighing the moral. They might be a jerk to the people around them, but they give a lot of money, so they're like, yeah, I'm morally great. But that might be wrong if the consequentialism is wrong. Similarly for vegetarianism, right? Some people might say, well, eating factory farm meat is a terrible thing because it leads to all this animal suffering. Others might be like, well, sure, it's, I guess, good to avoid it, but eating hamburger is not so bad, right? And depending on what the moral truth is, for moral realists, one or the other of those groups might be substantially misweighing morality, and that could, of course, substantially influence their self-ratings. Another example of this might be, as I mentioned before, disregarding the seriousness of sexual harassment. Someone who might engage in some sexual harassment and think, it's just harmless teasing. I mean, maybe I shouldn't have done it, but yeah, no big deal. Whereas maybe in fact, it is a really big deal, and is highly negatively experienced, and appropriately so, by the person who's a target of the sexual harassment. That would be a serious case of failing to weigh different aspects of morality. So the person who engages in that might think of themselves as, hey, I'm a really good guy. Maybe I tease people a little bit, but I'm still a 5 on first scale, right? Whereas in fact, they might be much lower than that. Self-raters might make excuses, right? So you say, I was tired, everyone cheats on their spouse if they can get away with it, or they might tend to excuse their own moral behavior. The fundamental attribution error might be relevant here, right? So this is the idea that when someone else does something morally bad, you tend to attribute it to their character. When you do something morally bad, you tend to attribute it to your situation, right? If you cut someone off in traffic, it's because you were distracted or because you're in a hurry. If someone else cuts you off in traffic, well, they're a jerk, or they're an asshole. And it could be the case that the least moral people are the most satisfied with their own excuses. They're the least likely to turn the self-critical lens upon themselves, and thus end up with higher self-ratings than people who are actually more moral. And let me just throw in the mix here another source of problems. I'm not a hardcore situationist, right? But I think there's probably something true in this idea of situationism. I assume most of you know what situationism is, but just a brief reminder, right? Situationism is the idea that broad, enduring character traits like being overall moral or being overall fair, they don't explain much, if any, of our behavior. What's really much more explanatory is what situations you're in, what immediate social and other kinds of pressures are going on, or what your mood is. So general, broad, enduring character traits don't have a big explanatory role in predicting people's behavior. Right? To the extent that's true, then this whole enterprise might be somewhat misguided, right? The very idea that you have a broad, enduring character traits like overall morality that are explanatorily important. Here's another way of thinking about some of these same issues. Probably most of you are familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's got a lot of attention in the popular presses recently. The idea is that the less you know that you don't know, right? So for example, this has been established repeatedly in psychology for examples like logic problems and humor and grammar, right? So people who are bad at formal logic of the sort that we teach in intro logic classes in philosophy tend to not think of themselves as very bad at formal logic, right? So they'll think things like, let's look at this logic problem. P implies Q, not Q. Therefore not P. I'm great at logic, right? They've affirmed the consequent, they've committed a logical error, but they don't notice this about themselves and think that they're good at logic. Similarly, people who it seems like from third-person ratings don't have particularly good senses of humor, aren't aware of the fact that they lack a good sense of humor. People who have poor grammar aren't aware of the fact that they have poor grammar. You don't see Dunning-Kruger effects with things like running speed, right? People who are not very fast runners are perfectly aware that they're not fast runners. People who are extroverts or introverts are aware of this fact about themselves, right? So what you see with Dunning-Kruger effects is that people tend to be poor at accurately assessing traits when the accurate assessment of that trait depends on having that trait, right? So accurately assessing whether you're good at logic requires being good at logic. Accurately assessing whether you have a good sense of humor requires having a good sense of humor. Accurately assessing whether you're good at grammar requires having, grammatical knowledge, right? But accurately assessing your running speed doesn't require being a fast runner. Accurately assessing whether you're an extrovert doesn't require being an extrovert, right? So how about moral character? I think there's some plausibility to think that this would be a Dunning-Kruger type trait. It would be a trait where the accurate assessment of your moral character requires, to some extent, I don't think it's as clear as clear Dunning-Kruger traits, right? But to some extent, it might require having that moral character, right? So to go back to, say, the sexist case, right? Accurately assessing the badness of one's sexist behavior might require having a kind of moral character that recognizes that sexist behavior is bad. Accurately assessing your fairness might require, to some extent, having a character that kind of can tell what counts as unfair behavior and what counts as fair behavior and why being unfair is important. I think this is especially going to be true for the case of jerkitude, which is what I want to focus on now. All right, so I have a theory of jerks. Jerk can mean a couple things in English. One is it could be like someone who's just kind of an ignorant fool. But the more common sense of the term in recent English usage is moral. And according to my theory of jerks, the essence of jerkitude is that you culpably fail to appreciate the perspectives of others around you, treating them as tools to be manipulated or fools to be dealt with, rather than as moral and epistemic peers. So being a jerk is both a moral failure and an epistemic failure, right? You misuse the people around you. You also don't see them as they really are. So jerks will tend to see the people around them in broad, negatively balanced social stereotypes, right? They'll see people as, hey, lowly secretaries and garden workers who aren't really worth their attention. They'll see maybe spoiled trust fund kids. They'll see suits, right? Oh, those business people, those people in those suits, right? They have no understanding of the meaning of life. They'll see others as stupid football fans, or they'll see professors as these kind of academics with their heads in the clouds who are clueless about the real world, right? So whoever it is around you that you don't kind of personally care about, you tend to paint in these broad negative categories, right? I think of this as seeing the world through jerk goggles, right? So if you're seeing the world through jerk goggles, you're not really appreciating the distinctive individuality of the people around you. You're not understanding that their perspectives and values might differ from yours and yet still be interesting and worth attending to, right? My example of this was I had the concept of the theory of jerks when I was talking with a friend of mine who had a boss who was a jerk. And this friend of mine was like, yeah, he's always seeing everybody else as an idiot. And he's always helping himself to the goods because he deserves them. Like, yeah, I'm surrounded. Everyone's an idiot. I'm surrounded by fools. I'm an important person. I'm going to help myself to all the goodies. And then shortly after that, I was in a post office and I was seeing the line of people in front of me in the post office. And I'm thinking, man, I don't want to be waiting this line. All these people in front of me are a bunch of fools. And right, I'm important. I don't want to stand in this line for half an hour while this old woman bumbles around with some stupid request. And as I was thinking this to myself, I'm like, oh man, I'm seeing the world through jerk goggles. I'm seeing the world just like that annoying boss of my friend. We also get moralistic jerks here, three famous ones from science fiction. We've got Bumble from Oliver Twist. We've got Scrooge from Christmas Carol. And we've got Snape from J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter novels, right? These are people who are full of disdain for the people around them, who are sure they're morally right, who condemn the people around them for moral feelings that they don't think they have, but they really are failing to appreciate the value and the individuality of the people around them. Now, of course, that doesn't mean they can't sometimes do good things. In the Harry Potter novels, of course, Snape ends up being a kind of hero, but I think we can all agree, if you're familiar with the novels, that Snape is a jerk in the relevant sense, right? Now, the opposite of the jerk is the sweetheart. SpongeBob is my favorite example of a sweetheart. The sweetheart is the opposite of the jerk in the sense that the sweetheart will lose track of their own priorities, right? They so vividly appreciate the perspectives and the values of the people around them that they kind of they're the one who let the hurried shopper in front of them in the checkout line, or stop to help the person who dropped their papers, or the person who's like, oh, you need help with this. Oh, they drop what they do in order to help someone else with someone else with something else. They can often fail to vigorously resist what needs to be resisted, right? They see that they're not going to stand up as readily to injustice because they're too nice. They can have their opinions and their priorities blown about by the wind, as SpongeBob does. All right, so jerks, I think, are especially poor at self-knowledge of their jerkitude, right? So the jerk will lack a sense of how he's seen by others. He wouldn't even think to take the point of view of others, right? So the jerk might rage against typos in the documents by a student or a secretary, but produce a torrent of typos himself, right? He wouldn't even think to apply the same standards to himself that he applies to others. The jerk is unlikely to listen to others, especially to listen sympathetically to others' criticisms of him. Right? I think, regardless of what one's politics are, I think U.S. former President Donald Trump is a pretty good example of a jerk, right? He's not going to sympathetically listen to critics, right? He's going to blow them off, right? Anyone who criticizes him is going to get painted in broad negative social categories, right? So there's a kind of paradox in jerkish self-knowledge, right? To really appreciate in some non-superficial way that you've been a jerk to somebody, you kind of have to appreciate, oh, I've just harmed somebody and that's bad, right? But that itself involves like stepping into the other person's shoes, seeing things from their perspective, appreciating their values and interests. And that's exactly what the jerk habitually fails to do, right? So the moment you really kind of feel the sting of like, oh, I've just been a jerk, in that very moment, you're becoming not a jerk. Conversely, the sweetheart, the opposite of the jerk, they're intensely aware of and ashamed by even minor transgressions, for whom the jerk would be oblivious, right? The sweetheart calls you up on the phone with this apology after they've been unintentionally rude, like, oh, I'm so sorry I said that thing. I hope you're not too offended. And you're like, what thing? I don't even remember. You were rude. Right? So the sweetheart has this kind of condemnation of thinking, they're worried that they've been a jerk, whereas the jerk is just like rude and then pays no attention to that fact. So in this case, I think you would not expect jerks to generally know that they're jerks. And you might expect sweethearts to be overly self-condemnatory. So if you try to introspect, am I a jerk? I think you're not gonna be able to find things out that way. You could try second person knowledge. You could say to a friend, hey, tell me, am I a jerk? Right? But that's also going to be kind of hard for jerks, because part of jerkitude is not really appreciating the perspective of others, especially those who are critical of you. So I think actually the most effective way of trying to figure out whether you're being a jerk or how habitually jerkish you are is to take a third person stance, which is to think about the people around you. Here's an example of a post office line. That's the picture, right? Think about the people around you. Think about the people you encounter every day. Do you tend to think of all the people that you run across every day as, in broad negative categories? Are you surrounded by fools and tools? Is everybody an idiot? Are you the only important person around, right? If that's how you see the world, if that's how you judge other people, that says something about you, right? So there's a saying in English, if you meet an asshole today, then you met an asshole. If everybody you meet today is an asshole, then you're the asshole. So I think we can notice, like I did in that post office line, when we're seeing the world through jerk goggles, and try to take those jerk goggles off and say, wait, I'm probably not really appreciating the interests and values of the people around me. So to conclude, I conjecture that there is a zero correlation between self-rated jerkitude and one's actual degree of jerkitude, and a zero correlation between self-assessment of overall moral character and actual moral character. I think people have just basically no self-knowledge of this. Now, zero isn't negative, right? I think there are some good people who are aware that they're good, and there are some rotten people who are aware that they're rotten. But lots of good people have high standards and think of themselves too negatively, and lots of rotten people have very low standards and think of themselves far too positively. So basically, I'm going to say that your moral self-opinion about yourself is no evidence of your overall moral character. All right, that's it. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Eric. Very, very interesting talk. And so now we have time for questions. Please raise your hand. Beate, please.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I have two questions, or maybe, yeah. So first, I'm a bit, or mine couldn't be a problem. So I think I'm convinced that by your arguments that there's this epistemic problem, especially jerks realizing that they are jerks and so on. But isn't there also a problem of what exactly is a moral character supposed to be? So what would be the truth maker of saying that I'm a very great moral character? And if at all, isn't that such a multi-dimensional, multifaceted thing that it is not a yes or no thing? So that already shows that these scales are just weird. And maybe it's just such a confused concept that doing research on that is just, it's such a big cluster concept that it just doesn't make sense to ask these questions like this. And this is probably already shown by, okay, let's just think about theoretically, what should be a person like that has a 5 on this scale, and what should be a person be like that has a 1? And it's probably impossible to answer. And maybe that shows already that this is weird to investigate. There's no phenomenon like the moral character. And secondly, couldn't be another problem, or not a problem, maybe an explanation for these results we see. And now I'm a little bit contradicting myself, but so if I would think about the people around me, I would say somehow, yes, they are all nice people. They there should be like 4s or 5s, but maybe this is just, on the one hand, I couldn't really rate my friends or people I know, they are all nice people, but maybe the fact that we all see ourselves and the people around us more on the right hand side of the scale is that the fact that when we think about who would be a 1, I think of, I don't know, Adolf Hitler. He's like a 0, and so he was an actual person, like really the evil. And then I think of people who I would think should be a 5. And I can think of like fictional characters, like really saints or something, but even Mother Teresa, she wasn't perfect. I don't know. So somehow my picture of the evil is like really evil, and the picture of the really good is normal. And somehow we are all more like normal. This is just what we would expect, so that we see the results more on the right hand side, because our scales are just not adjusted to having like, in the middle is the middle of, this is like medium good. No, we have the like really, really evil on the left side, but the okay good on the right side. And that this might also explain why we make these judgments.
Yeah. On the second point, one of the things that's interesting about this is if you ask, if you have peer raters that tend to rate people actually higher than they rate themselves. So even though people themselves tend to be near the top of these scales, if you ask their peers, it's even higher, right? So there's definitely ceiling effects going on, especially with peer ratings. So, I mean, that fits with some of what you said, but also the idea is you don't need to be a saint in order to get a 5 on these scales. I take your point about, people who are presented as heroes. We have some Mother Teresa or Martin Luther King or whoever, if you look at their biographies, they're non-ideal things. Which raises this question of like, is there general moral character? Your first question, right? Back to the truth maker thing. Is there such a thing as an overall general moral character? I guess here I'm inclined to, I'm a moderate realist. I'm not sure there's a single thing which is, here is the exact, this person's 3.69 on the scale, right? But, Stalin was morally worse than Martin Luther King. I'm pretty sure of that, right? He might have had some virtues and King might have had some failings, but, like there's some reality to that difference. So exactly how much specificity there is, I think I'm a moderate incommensurist, right? There's some, you can't how exactly do you weigh being nice to the people around you versus taking stands for moral causes? Maybe there's no exact correct way to weight that. I think about other cases like being a good father or being a good teacher. There are lots of dimensions of that maybe don't all fit nicely against each other. But you can still kind of like say, yeah, this person's a better father than that one, or that person's a better teacher than that one. Or to use an example from Susan Wolf, she, the American game of baseball, she says, look, maybe there's no fact about who the best baseball player was last year this season. Right. But there are a few candidates, right? You can't exactly weigh all the various virtues of a sports player against each other, right? So there may be no one fact about who's best, but we know it's not going to be this person. It's not going to be this person. It's not going to be this person. It's going to be, one of these people up here. Right. So something like that, right? We can have, I do think it's plausible that for all the facts about morality having different dimensions and situationism being true and nobody being perfect, there's still some kind of rough truth in claims that overall this person probably is a morally better person than this other one, if we can say everything about their lives. You want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree that these comparisons are possible. But maybe this is what is problematic about these scales, that they're not comparing. So maybe if you ask people, are you better than Stalin, or are you better than Mother Teresa, or maybe they could honestly answer these. Maybe then these are better tools to investigate this.
Oh, that's interesting. So you have some explicit comparison point. Yeah. Yeah, the problem is people might have different opinions about Mother Teresa. Some people really like Mother Teresa. Other people think she was pretty, not actually a morally good person at all. I think almost everyone would agree about Stalin or Hitler, but I guess not even everybody there. So that introduces another source of noise.
But you can ask that
exemplars
beforehand and just ask them whether they think that Mother Teresa was a good person. And
so you'd have like a measure, like think of 5 exemplars of moral excellence, think of 5 exemplars of moral terribleness. Now rate yourself relative to these people. Yeah, that'd be an interesting kind of approach. I haven't seen that done. I kind of like that idea. Yeah, that could be an interesting scale. I mean, I still suspect that Trump would be like, well, you know, there's me and Lincoln, there's me and Jesus, and we're kind of about the same. Right? So I still predict a 0 correlation basically, but that would be an interesting approach. I think that would be an intriguing thing to try and see if you get some kinds of different results than you do with a kind of simpler than a simpler approach to the scale.
Great, thank you. Is there any other question? Again?
yes, I have just you said you are expecting another 0 correlation. Can you say again, correlation between what?
Between, to the extent it's real, and you raised good questions about this, and I have some hesitation about this, right? To the extent it's real, a person's overall moral character, or more specifically, their jerkitude, not that jerkitude and moral character are identical, right? That would be one more specific thing than overall moral character. But their jerkitude and also their overall moral character and how they self-rate according to the scale that we just concocted.
Okay, I do have a question as well. Actually, I have 2 questions. And the first is, like, you talk about the Dunning-Kruger effect, and yeah, in this effect, what we found is that people with low training about in for example in logic or in grammar, then rate themselves higher than their actual behavior or performance. So I was wondering, like in the case of morality, what that would mean, in the sense, like, I mean, if we want them to have like a higher, I mean, if we want them to be more accurate about their performance in morality, then I was wondering whether you would say that then they would need like a stronger moral education, or a more like a moral training or something like that. Would that be effective in order to reduce their illusion of morality?
I am somewhat skeptical about moral education. I am inclined to think we don't know what kinds of things help produce more moral people. I'm not a totally radical skeptic about it. I think we're not totally clueless, but the idea that, say, we know how to teach business ethics in a way that produces people who will actually be more ethical business people, that I'm skeptical of, or like religious institutions that try to help children become more moral by teaching them the Bible or whatever. I'm skeptical that we know how well those programs work, or that they work in general very well. So I'm not sure. And sometimes what happens is they increase smugness maybe without increasing actual moral behavior. So it could be the case that under certain conditions you'll get better self-knowledge as a result of a moral training course, but I'd be pretty cautious about that inference in general.
No, I totally agree, and I think that then the question would be like, what would it be a training course? Like, what would it be?
Right.
And actually, and then like a third motivation for a follow-up of this question would be like, so what about your experiments on teaching about animal ethics and people eating less meat? Wouldn't that count as something like an indirect, because you're not telling them you shouldn't eat meat, moral training?
Yeah. So right. So what I found with Peter Singer and Brad Coquelet is that when you teach undergraduates in Southern California about meat ethics, right, about factory farms, they'll tend to eat less meat. And this is not by self-report. This is, we actually looked at their meat purchases on campus by looking at their the receipts on their dining cards. And this has been replicated independently at another campus in Southern California also. So it does seem like teaching students about factory farming reduces their consumption of meat somewhat, but dependably on average. So is that moral training? Yeah, maybe. Right. So we assume, I'm inclined to assume there's a broad consensus in philosophy that eating less factory farmed animals is morally good. There's dissensus about whether it's morally required, but I think virtually everybody thinks that it's morally, good. So yeah, so maybe that's a kind of moral training. I guess my inclination in terms of what actually has effects on people's behavior is that shifting people's opinions about how their peers behave is the most effective thing. So my guess, and this is not the most obvious thing to draw from the studies and not what Peter Singer and Brad Coquelet draw from it, but my guess is that what's happening in these studies is that students who are in the class come to think, oh, you know what? Maybe vegetarianism isn't as weird as I thought when I was in high school, right? Maybe my TA is a vegetarian, or this other person in this class who's nodding along with the arguments, so you're shifting their opinions about their peers, and that's what's having the effect, more than here's this valid argument that we should avoid eating factory farm meat. Right? And this fits with what I call the moral mediocrity hypothesis. The moral mediocrity hypothesis is that people aim to be about as morally good as their peers. They don't aim to be morally good by absolute standards, and they don't aim to be the morally best person in the room or the morally worst person in the room. They want to be about morally average, or maybe a little higher than morally average among their peers. And so the way then that people's behavior changes is not that they discover that something is morally good, right? So here's how it would work for vegetarianism, right? So if you discover, say factually, let's just assume it's a fact that it's good to become morally vegetarian, that doesn't change your behavior. What happens is you keep eating meat, but now you feel bad about it. So your moral opinion of your own character goes down, and your moral opinion of your peers' character goes down, but your behavior doesn't change. That's what the moral mediocrity hypothesis will predict. But if you come to believe that there are a lot of your peers who are reducing their meat consumption, that's the kind of thing that would change your behavior.
Great, thanks. I have another question, but I will leave. I will give the turn to Salvador.
Thanks. I mean, you didn't give a definite statement on this, but I was just wondering whether you thought that, this moral self-ignorance of jerks sort of supported the idea that moral character was a Dunning-Kruger effect type trait, or rather that it would owed to the particular way in which jerks are morally deficient. I mean, that would be, I know, probably a conjecture, but I was just thinking that I mean, there may be, ways of being morally deficient which do not necessarily imply that one is unaware of one's moral deficiency. I particularly thought that it would seem to me like the sweetheart could be, morally deficient insofar, in some cases at least, insofar precisely as they do not resist things that they should resist, and so are complacent. But nevertheless, since they are aware of, of other people's perspectives of them, they may, there may not be such a big Dunning-Kruger effect there. So I was just wondering whether you intuitively thought that, that the jerks were just a particular case, which you could somehow extend in order to make the case that, that there's that moral character is a Dunning-Kruger effect type trait.
Yeah. I'm inclined to think that jerkitude in particular is Dunning-Krugerish, because knowing that you're a jerk kind of require, or knowing that you've behaved jerkishly kind of requires knowing other people, appreciating other people's perspectives. So to the extent that you have the so to speak skill of not being a jerk, you need to apply that skill in order to self-rate yourself in terms of jerkitude. Right? But there are other moral character traits where that is less clear. Like, so for example, kindness. If there is a widely discussed moral trait that there might be a little bit of a positive correlation between self-ratings and overall trait, it might be something like kindness, because kindness is less Dunning-Krugerish in the sense that you don't really need to be kind to evaluate how kind you are. I mean, I think people who are unkind maybe don't appreciate exactly how unkind they are. But I also think there's a kind of a dimension in which you can recognize, yeah, that person's a kinder person than I am. So it could be that different kind of moral traits are differently Dunning-Krugerish. Overall morality, I'm going to guess, is in the direction of being Dunning-Krugerish, but I don't think the Dunning-Kruger, the specific Dunning-Kruger thing, that is having to have the skill in order to know whether you have the skill, is going to be the full explanation of the zero correlation. I think it might be an important part of the explanation, but I think there are other reasons to think there might be zero correlations, such as just more ordinary practices of self-deception.
Thanks, that makes sense.
Great, thank you. And I think we are running out of time, but still I would like to ask you the last question. And insofar it seems that moral improvement, at least to some extent, I mean, at least from the traditional point of view, seems to need some kind of self-knowledge of your own dispositions and dispositional behaviors. And in this talk, and in like most of your work, you have denied that you have some kind of, I mean, and it's difficult to get this kind of self-knowledge. And now you're showing us that it's difficult to have self-knowledge about moral attitudes. And therefore, I was wondering whether you think that we are morally doomed. So is it really impossible to get some moral improvement?
I am not, doom is too strong a word. I suspect there are ways to become morally better. But I am not confident that people have a very good sense of those ways, right? So people who like say, okay, I'm going to become morally better, and then they engage in some attempt at self-improvement. I haven't, and this is more just anecdotal than based in research, but my impression is that the result is more often smugness at the end of the process than actual moral improvement. And similarly, you know, when someone tries to morally improve other people, like parents do with children, or religious school teachers do with children, or people teaching applied ethics classes try to do with their students, sometimes that works, but sometimes it backfires. So what I'm going to say is it's not impossible, but I don't think we have a very good sense of what programs for self or application to others are actually effective.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Beate, and thank you, Eric, for your talks. It was very nice to have you here and to be able to talk and discuss your own research. Now we will have a short break. I propose having a 10-minute break, and then we will continue with the talks by the students of the Institute. We will have 3 talks by 3 students, and yeah, I'll introduce you to them in 10 minutes. So thank you again, and see you in 10 minutes.